The first time Marek lifted a manhole cover, the smell hit him with such force that he almost dropped it back into place. It was late July 1944. The evening heat trapped between the burnt-out shells of Warsaw's tenements, and smoke from distant fires mixed with the sour stench that rose from the circle of darkness at his feet. Around him, the courtyard was almost silent. Window panes were taped in crisscross patterns, stairwells were dark, and the only sound was the occasional dull thump of artillery somewhere beyond the Vistula. He leaned on the iron edge, fingers slick with sweat, and listened. Above ground, a German truck rattled across the cobblestones at the end of the street, gears grinding, a burst of coarse laughter echoing between the buildings. Beneath him, from that black shaft of air, came nothing. No echo of water, no clink of boots, but a thick, still breath of rot, ammonia, and something metallic that he could already taste on his tongue. The manhole looked like the mouth of an animal, patient and hungry. The insurgents had told him the sewers were a map of the city no German could read. Marek had grown up in this neighborhood and knew every courtyard, every gate, every shortcut between tenement blocks. But until the underground took him in, no one had spoken to him about what lay below. It had been just the drains, the place where filth went and never came back. Now his new commander had unfolded a hand-sketched diagram on a kitchen table, tracing lines in pencil that crisscrossed under familiar street names. Some tunnels were thicker, carrying the main flow. Others were narrow feeders like capillaries. These lines, the commander had said, were roads of last resort. When the uprising came, messages, weapons, even whole units might have to move through them, invisible to the Germans who thought they controlled Warsaw because they controlled its streets. For now, Marek's job was simple. Go down once, learn one short stretch, bring back proof that he could do it without panicking or getting lost. His first descent was clumsy and slow. A rope looped under his arms, hands slippery on the iron rungs, boots feeling for each step on the slimy wall. The light from the courtyard above shrank to a pale circle, then to a faint ring as someone gently lowered the cover until only a crescent remained. In those final seconds before it closed, Marek heard German voices from the far end of the street, sharp, bored, dismissive. "Partisans," one of them said in accented Polish, "always hide in attics. Rats go up, not down." Another laughed, and the sound cut off as the manhole slammed shut with a clean ring of steel. For a heartbeat, the noise echoed in the chamber. Then the darkness swallowed it. Marek stood in water up to his calves, the current tugging at his boots, the air thick and warm, his breathing suddenly too loud in his own ears. He lit his carbide lamp, and the little bluish flame carved a small bubble of color out of the black. The tunnel was barely taller than he was. In some stretches, he knew, they were lower still, only 90 centimeters high and 60 wide, forcing men and women to crawl for hours through a choking mix of sewage and gases. The walls were damp brick, sweating moisture that glistened in the weak light, and overhead the arched ceiling narrowed just enough to make him feel watched. The water carried unidentifiable debris past him, a floating scrap of paper, a bloated leaf, something too pale to look at for long. The smell was a living thing, pressing against his nostrils, filling his lungs. He gagged once, forced himself to swallow, then remembered the instructions. Count your steps, mark each junction, never trust your sense of direction, and above all, do not panic if you hear explosions. An explosion meant someone else's world, far above. By the time the uprising began on August 1st, Marek could walk 2 different stretches of the sewers, nearly blind. He knew the bend where the current deepened to his knees, and the place where a broken brick gave him a shin-deep wound the first time he didn't lift his foot high enough. Above, Warsaw erupted. Home army units rose from hiding, attacking German posts, cutting telephone lines, seizing police stations, and hoisting white and red flags that suddenly appeared from balconies and rooftops. Below, the map his commander had drawn on the kitchen table began to thicken with pencil marks. New routes, new arrowheads, new symbols where lines had to be avoided because a section had collapsed or someone had nearly passed out there days earlier. The Germans countered with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, turning districts like Wola and the Old Town into killing grounds. But the city did not fall at once. It fractured instead, breaking into isolated insurgent-held pockets. Old Town, Śródmieście, Żoliborz, Mokotów, cut off from one another by German strongpoints and main roads. Very quickly, the tunnels under Marek's boots stopped being roads of last resort and became the only roads that still belonged fully to the Poles. The underground sewer system enabled insurgents to move between those separated districts, allowing them to shift messages, medicine, and even entire units under the feet of German patrols that believed the city was sealed to guerrilla movement. It would eventually allow more than 5,000 soldiers to slip from the doomed Old Town to the inner city, prolonging the fight. None of this was obvious in those first days, and certainly not to the occupiers. German officers walked the main thoroughfare thoroughfares with maps in hand, drawing red pencils across streets to mark cleared zones, convinced that once a district was encircled on paper, it was encircled in reality. Marek got his first taste of their arrogance when he was sent on a run from a workshop near the Old Town to a staff post closer to Śródmieście. The route he was given looked impossible. On the surface, the stretch was crawling with German patrols. Below, it depended on a barely charted connection between two main collectors, one of which was said to flood without warning when pumps upstream failed. The message in his pocket was wrapped in waxed paper, then tucked inside an empty cigar tube, then slipped into the lining of his shirt. So many layers to keep a few lines of writing from dissolving into nothing in the foul water. "If you lose the message," his commander had said, eyes level, "you lose people you'll never know existed. If you drop it in the current, you might as well have shot someone yourself." The words settled on his shoulders like a weight heavier than his satchel. Above ground, he reached the rendezvous courtyard just as a German propaganda truck pulled into the nearby intersection. Loudspeakers mounted on the roof barked in clumsy Polish about bandits and terrorists, promising that the Wehrmacht controlled every street, every building, every escape. Only rats, the voice said, would choose to hide in filth instead of surrendering. A burst of laughter rose from a squad of soldiers listening. One of them kicked at a manhole cover with the toe of his boot and said something in German. Marek caught only the word for sewer and pigsty before he slipped into the shadows of the stairwell. They still saw the tunnels as nothing more than a disgusting detail of city maintenance, something for Polish workers to worry about when the war was over. The idea that anyone might willingly vanish into that filth to fight them there seemed beneath contempt. The contempt was their first mistake. When Marek went down that day, his carbide lamp flickering with every step, he knew he was walking through a space the Germans did not yet truly see. The manhole closed above him, and the speech from the truck was cut off mid-sentence, as if someone had slammed a door. In its place came the soft rush of water and, more ominously, the distant echoes of explosions somewhere far away, transmitted through brick and metal as a dull, underwater thud. The tunnel narrowed, forcing him to bend, then stoop, then brace one hand on the slick wall to keep his balance. His breath sounded harsh, and he could feel sweat trickling down his back, soaking the paper and metal pressed against his chest. At the first junction, he counted under his breath, recalling the map. Right at 30 steps after the ladder, then straight for 100, then left at the thicker flow. The air changed with each turn, sometimes warmer, sometimes edged with a cold draft that hinted at a distant shaft. Halfway through the journey, he heard something new, a faint scraping somewhere ahead, then a splash, then whispered curses in Polish. He froze, instinctively reaching for the pistol in his belt, his lamp hand trembling. A second later, another lamp flickered to life around the curve, then another, and he found himself face to face with a line of fighters he had never seen before. Men with stubble and sunburned faces, women with their hair bandaged under helmets too large for them, each of them with a bundle of rifles, crates, and canvas bags. They were coming from Old Town, one of them explained, being shifted to reinforce positions elsewhere. It was the first time he understood that the tunnels could carry not just one messenger at a time, but whole detachments, moving in complete darkness for hours to appear in impossible places. As the column squeezed past him in the stinking water, shoulders brushing, boots slipping in the slime, he caught the grit blanketing their faces like a uniform, and the exhausted determination in their eyes. They had come 6 hours through this underworld, someone muttered, feeling their way along the walls, counting junctions, swallowing nausea and fear each time the ceiling lowered. On the surface, the balance tilted steadily against the insurgents. The German counter-offensive crushed Wola with brutal efficiency, then turned toward the Old Town, bringing with it heavier artillery, armor, and special SS formations accustomed to punitive operations. Civilians died in courtyards, in basements, in makeshift hospitals marked with red crosses that did not stop the bombs. The Old Town became what historians would later call the decisive battlefield of the Uprising, a pocket the Germans were determined to erase. Inside that pocket, however, the sewers worked like veins, keeping sections of the body alive long after they should have gone cold. Marek found himself assigned more and more frequently to sewer duty, carrying not only messages now, but vials of morphine, rolls of bandages, precious radio components wrapped in scraps of oilcloth, and once, a dozen handfuls of dried bread soaked in grease. So small a weight for so many hungry mouths waiting on the other end. With each descent, the tunnels changed. The air grew more dangerous. The Germans, slow at first to understand how much the resistance relied on the sewers, began to adapt. They heard rumors of units appearing from nowhere, of civilians slipping away from encircled areas without ever crossing a street, and the pattern of insurgent strikes around sewer exits was too consistent to ignore. German engineers studied maps of the sewer system, and infantry units began experimenting with ways to turn this invisible battlefield against its Polish users. They dropped grenades and smoke bombs through manholes suspected of being used by the resistance, trying to suffocate or disorient those inside, and in some stretches, they even experimented with gas canisters. The stories reached Marek long before concrete orders did. A patrol gone missing after entering a tunnel too soon after such an attack. A courier who panicked when the air thickened with a smell that wasn't sewage and ran blindly into a side branch that led nowhere. Once, Marek felt the edge of that terror himself. He was leading a pair of young scouts, girls barely 16, both wearing Home Army armbands carefully wrapped in paper in their pockets, so they could be denied if needed, along a route from the old town to a contact near Bankowy Square. The tunnel there carried less water, but the air was heavier, the roof low enough that they had to crouch for long stretches. Somewhere behind them, a hollow metal clang echoed through the system, followed a long moment later by a muted boom that shook the bricks and sent a wave of warmer, dust-laden air rolling over them. One of the girls coughed violently, wiping at her eyes as they began to sting. Marek forced himself not to breathe too fast, remembering the advice of a sewer veteran. If you meet smoke or gas, go lower, closer to the water, where the current can sometimes thin the cloud. He ordered them to wrap their faces in wet cloth, then pressed ahead, counting and counting and counting until at last, the smell thinned and the air cooled again. Behind them, unseen, the gas cloud dissipated in the labyrinth, trapped between junctions, harmless only because they had not lingered. The more the Germans tried to poison or block the tunnels, the more the Polish command made them its own. The sewers became strictly regulated, with guides who knew specific stretches like shepherds in the dark. Routes were assigned, timings calculated, rules enforced with the same seriousness as any frontline order. Civilians could be moved only when a section was cleared in advance. Entire family groups would be walked single file through waist-deep filth for hours, children gagging into their mothers' skirts to stop themselves from screaming. Despite German attempts, the underground network remained, for the duration of the uprising, essentially the turf of the Polish underground, a domain enemy soldiers rarely entered and never truly controlled. Over time, Marek realized that what had begun as a desperate improvisation was hardening into a kind of doctrine. Under total enemy superiority above ground, the battle could still be contested below. The turning point in his memory came at the end of August, when the old town was finally bleeding out. The district had withstood weeks of bombardment, but ammunition, food, and medical supplies were almost gone. German units were closing from all sides, and fire had reduced entire streets to jagged lines of chimneys. Rumors spread that the command had decided the old town could not be held. To simply surrender would mean mass executions and deportations. To attempt a breakout on the surface under German artillery and machine gun fire would be slaughter. That left one option. Orders began to circulate in whispers. Key units and representatives of the underground state would withdraw through the sewers to Śródmieście, leaving behind a skeleton force to cover the final retreat. The main exit would be through one of the manholes near Krasinski Square, where, at the intersection with Druga Street, a sewer entrance connected the old town with other districts. Marek was assigned as a guide and courier for one of these evacuating groups. On the surface, the square was hell, a field of rubble edged by shattered facades, with craters where fountains had been, and blackened trees stripped of leaves by blast and fire. The air tasted of plaster dust and cordite. Every few minutes, shells crashed somewhere near the line of tenements, sending up fountains of brick shards and glass. Near the statue that had once seemed imposing and eternal, a queue had formed. Soldiers, many of them from famous battalions whose names the city whispered with pride, alongside civilians chosen to carry the continuity of institutions, scribes, couriers, a few politicians and priests. Each was waiting for a turn to descend, to vanish from this burning world into one far worse in the short term, but, strangely, more survivable in the long. German shells fell so close that sometimes the ground itself seemed to recoil, dust sifting down onto helmets and bare heads alike, but the line did not break. The manhole they used here was different from the quiet one in Marek's first descent. Its cover had been levered aside so many times in recent days that the stone around it was chipped. The ladder rungs were slick with mud from hundreds of boots. Marek stood near the opening, checking names and units against a list in his hand, his voice hoarse from shouting over the noise. One by one, men and women descended, disappearing into the sharp smell rising from below. At his feet, a young officer grinned with an effort that didn't reach his eyes and muttered, "If the Germans could see us now, they'd die laughing. Heroes of Warsaw, crawling through shit." Marek shook his head and said, "Let them laugh. They think the city ends at the pavement." That was the core arrogance, he realized. The occupiers still saw Warsaw as a grid of of streets and squares, something they could draw on a map and own. The insurgents had learned to think of it as a three-dimensional maze: cellars, attics, and, most of all, sewers. When his turn came to go down with a group, the tunnel was already filled with a slow-moving column of figures, each with a hand on the shoulder of the one ahead. Lamps were partially hooded to conserve carbide, casting more shadow than light. The air was so thick with heat, breath, and waste that Marek felt each inhalation as an act of will. Above, distant and smothered, came the rumble of prolonged explosions as German units closed in on what remained of the old town's surface defense. Here, below, the sound was like thunder heard underwater, present, but strangely distant. The flow of the sewage tugged at their ankles. Every so often, someone stumbled and splashed, cursing softly, only to be hauled back into line by those behind and ahead. Metal clinked, rifle slings, canteens, stray shell casings in someone's pocket. In the dark, there was no difference between an officer and a private, a famous battalion veteran and a teenage runner. Everyone was reduced to breathing, step after step, counting silently to remember the junctions that would mean survival or a slow death in some blind branch. The journey from the old town to Śródmieście that night took hours. For some groups, it stretched to 6, like the earlier detachments that had pioneered the longer routes under the city. Men fainted and had to be carried. Occasionally, the column stopped for a minute so that someone could vomit into the water and then stumble on. In one narrow section, the ceiling dropped so low that even the shortest had to bend almost double, and the taller fighters shuffled under it with their backs scraping against slick brick. Marek remembered the texture of that ceiling against his shoulders more vividly than any firefight. How cold it felt, how close, as if the weight of the entire ruined city above them were resting on that few inches of masonry. Somewhere ahead, a guide whispered instructions at each junction. "Old town behind you, left for Śródmieście. Keep moving, there's no space to go back." When Marek's group finally climbed up toward a manhole in a courtyard deep inside the central district, the first breath of night air felt unreal. The cover slid aside, and one by one they emerged into a different Warsaw, a city equally damaged, but not yet crushed in the same way, where resistance headquarters still functioned, and where there were streets the Germans had not fully reclaimed. Around them, local insurgents stared, recognizing familiar armbands and faces from units they had believed to be lost. Later, historians would note that approximately 300 soldiers were evacuated from the old town to the city center through the sewers, keeping the uprising alive for weeks longer than might otherwise have been possible. For Marek, what mattered was the look on a friend's face when they met by chance in a doorway that night. A friend from a completely different district who blurted, "You're alive? How did you get here?" and then laughed in disbelief when the answer came, "Under your feet." The Germans never fully shook off their initial scorn for the sewers as a serious theater of operations. Even when they understood that the tunnels were being used for movement, they struggled to project power into them. Their attempts, grenades, smoke, gas, were brutal but clumsy, often harming no one or, worse from their perspective, confirming to the insurgents just how little control they had in that realm. The occupiers continued to focus on dominating crossroads, squares, railway stations, and bridges, convinced that controlling these nodes on the surface map meant controlling the flow of the battle. They did not see that beneath their boots ran a second network, one in which their red arrows and neat lines of advance meant very little. It was that blind spot, as much as any single act of bravery, that allowed Marek and those like him to keep running, carrying messages, ammunition, and hope between districts they should never have been able to reach. In the end, of course, the uprising was crushed. By October, after 63 days of fighting, Warsaw's resistance command agreed to lay down arms in exchange for the treatment of insurgents as prisoners of war rather than criminals. Entire neighborhoods were systematically destroyed. Civilians were driven from their homes in long columns that stretched across the plains. The sewers, once crowded with fighters and families, returned to their original purpose, anonymous and unremarked. But something of what had happened there refused to vanish. In the years that followed, survivors would speak of their time underground with a mixture of horror and pride, remembering the choking air, the burns on their hands from gripping wet bricks for hours, and the moment when a guide's hand tapped 3 times on the wall to signal a turn that might mean life. Filmmakers would later recreate those journeys, capturing the claustrophobia and desperation of groups fleeing through waist-deep sewage while a doomed city burned above. For Marek, looking back decades later, the arrogance of the occupiers was symbolized not by a speech or an order, but by a single careless gesture, a German soldier's boot tapping a manhole cover as he laughed at the idea of rats hiding in filth. The soldier had believed the war existed only on the plane he could see, the plane of streets, boulevards, and squares, where firepower and armor were the only currencies. He had never understood understood that the people he mocked were drawing a different map beneath his feet, one in which the narrowest tunnel, the foulest stench, and the darkest corner could be turned into a corridor of resistance. In that world, it was the Germans who were clumsy giants, stomping across a floor they did not own, their every step reverberating through brick and water as a warning to those below. Warsaw would rebuild in time. New buildings rose over the lines where Marek once walked through darkness. Tourists would someday stroll across squares where manholes had been guarded by insurgents with pistols and notebooks. At Krasinski Square, a monument would appear showing fighters both in the open and descending into the sewers, freezing in bronze the moment when the battle moved from surface to underground. Yet the real memorial to that invisible front lay in the stories carried by men like him and by the young scouts he had led, who later told their children and grandchildren that on some nights of 1944, the only paths of freedom in Warsaw ran through tunnels of waste and darkness. The uprising failed in its immediate aim, but the memory of those who fought in every dimension of the city, attics, cellars, and especially sewers, turned the occupiers' contempt into a long, slow defeat of a different kind. The Nazis had laughed at the rat tunnels. In the end, it was from those tunnels that Warsaw's most enduring defiance rose, unseen, to shape the story the world would remember.